Here from Oxford University, and a warm welcome to all of you attending this seminar. Over the last 2 years, we built a really dynamic and international group of researchers and students, and we look forward to doing the same this year. A few housekeeping rules. For those of you attending via Teams, please keep mics on mute during the paper, and please add your name and affiliation into the chat. The seminar paper this evening will last approximately 50 minutes, after which the virtual and physical floor is open to questions. During the Q&A, please raise your hand using the hand function on the top bar of the screen or write in the chat. Please keep your video on, as it's nice for the speaker to see your faces. And finally, this is a note to say that the seminar will be recorded and uploaded to the Project Vimeo Human Flourishing site, details of which have been put in the chat. Finally, before I say a few words of introduction to our speaker tonight, I would like to introduce you to our colleagues on this project, especially the TWCF Visiting Fellow, Dr. Garin Kalustian from World Learning in Lebanon, and Dr. Alvaro Balaguia from the University of Navarra, Pamplona, Spain, who's also visiting this project. Dr. Jonathan Beale, a writer and podcaster on human flourishing from Harvard, is also joining us again this year, as is Luana de Borst, who has made a surprise visit from Ethiopia. We would especially like to extend our thanks to the Templeton World Charity Foundation, who have generously funded this research project. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this seminar series, like the previous two in our research program on education purpose and human flourishing in uncertain times, explores how you might better understand the idea, or indeed the ideal, of flourishing, and the importance of education as a pathway to it. Previously, we first examined a variety of important concepts concerning personhood and society as it relates to flourishing, such as character and virtue, and asked whether flourishing lies in the development of these. In the second seminar series, we turned our attention to other notions interdependently related to flourishing, specifically the notions of culture and context. We asked whether and how the development of mind and social-emotional qualities such as character, virtue, open-mindedness, resilience, and actualisation are differently, but no less meaningfully, shaped by culture across world contexts. In this third series, we're turning to the impact of history and politics on pathways and understandings of human flourishing. We asked to what extent we should consider enabling and disabling factors in national and international contexts, and point towards examples of collective endeavour and struggle in response to adversity. We are very excited to open our new series of seminars with a paper from Dr. David Johnson, who is the project director for this research. David is a man of many parts. Originally from South Africa, his early academic journey was marked with activism against the then apartheid regime, in which he endured incarceration, torture, and exile. Living in Botswana, then Zimbabwe, he came to the UK and moved to Oxford in 2003, where he is now University Reader in Comparative and International Education and Professorial Fellow of St. Antony's College. He's a chartered educational psychologist, and his research on culture, learning, and cognition has concentrated largely on Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. In addition to his academic work, David has held a number of senior public and university appointments, including recent service as junior proctor at Oxford University, one of the senior officers and trustees of Oxford. He has returned from sabbatical in South Africa to present this paper. David, over to you and your paper on Bhutan, Human Flourishing at the Confluence of Old and Modern Meanings of Life.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for that rather generous introduction. I hardly recognise myself, but there we are. I did just arrive at Heathrow at 5 o'clock this morning after huge drama in Cape Town, which I won't explain yesterday. But I have had a thoroughly exciting time in the newspaper archives and trying to write my memoirs of exactly 40 years ago when I left South Africa as a man with hair and a beard. I retained some of the beard, though it's a different colour, but sadly no hair. So that's been a huge discovery, particularly photographs of my younger, rather more radical days. Anyway, a less radical paper than tonight. And in opening this series, in opening this third year of this series, in the first we looked almost psychologically, as it were, looked across many writings on person and personhood at the individual and tried to find within the core of individual personalities the idea of flourishing. And of course, there's an enormous amount of work in positive psychology and beyond of that dates to Aristotle or Maslow as philosophers and psychologists alike, looking at what human flourishing might mean at the individual level. And of course, we flourish at different rates and in different ways as individuals. In the second year of the series, we shifted the focus to flourishing as an outcome of group activities, recognizing, and perhaps not every paper did this as well as it could, but recognizing community activities, recognizing, in a sense, collective struggle, collective endeavour, and how people often give up at some points in time the notion of flourishing as an individual in favour of the idea of their communities achieving collectively goals and desires that they aspire to. In my own paper, I think I referred fondly to work that I've done over many years in contexts such as urban slums in Pakistan, where projects of a developmental kind, social kind, and engineering kind were able to bring collectively to communities. And we saw this growth and human joy and really an upliftment of the human collective condition as people work together to clear their areas of still standing water that attracted mosquitoes that kill their young children with malaria, how they work together to connect open drain sewers to tertiary infrastructure, clean their roads, ensure that their schools remained stable and that their health facilities grew, and so on. And that was really, I think, an important shift in where we wanted to take this research project. This year, and I have the joy of opening this year's seminar series again, we shift our focus really to the national and international level and look at the role of countries in mediating or steering, if you like, facilitating human flourishing. And of course, at the country level, we are then, as we should be, aware of national development efforts, political efforts that all are deeply associated with not only national values. If we look around us today at countries like India or China, there's a whiff in the air of national projects that are becoming increasingly and narrowly nationalistic, so building nations on the basis of, for example, Hinduism, or China embarking really on a very hard and sometimes harsh territorial view of its own national development. What does this mean for facilitating, if you like, human development? So, of course, national projects and where they go, the United States, and one might argue the UK, and embracing populism, and increasingly, if we look at European politics, the embrace of more sets of singular national values away from perhaps pluralism to remaking of societies in a way that we recognize them perhaps 20 years ago, more singular rather than plural, more closed rather than diverse. And it seems that national populations are voting more and more, giving applause, in a sense, to more populist, more right-wing inclined governments across Europe. So these are, not only dangerous times for us, but uncertain times. And I would really like to turn tonight's attention to perhaps a country that is not as well known as it might be, and to look at it historically, and to look at how Bhutan, in particular, has attempted over time to deal with a tension between essentially holding on very dearly to traditional values, whilst a view has strongly emerged that Bhutan needs to perhaps become a more modern society in order to provide its youth with the opportunities that youth elsewhere enjoy. So the tension, this is a tension that is more that is inspired by, if you like, national differences between conservation and modernization, but it sits within a global framework, and clearly a strong global push for most countries, as many of you would know and appreciate, to hold on to certain sets of, for example, macroeconomic values, to look at human development in a particular way, to look at outcomes of economic endeavour in a specific way. So, increasing growth national product, or as wealth is measured, is seen often as having a strong significance, a strong relationship to economic growth, and therefore to public facilities, public and social service delivery, and health and education. So there's a very strong human capital view on what modernization looks like, and how we encourage our social institutions to adopt those more globally inspired values. Bhutan, which might come through in the paper, has of course set out its own stall. Basically, suggested that happiness, human happiness more than human capital in the classic way, is an important aspiration. And what does that mean for Bhutan? What does that mean for its population? Has everyone embraced that project? I won't necessarily be talking about the gross national happiness as a main focus of the paper, but rather try and trace, in a sense, through using Bhutan as a case, this question of national development, of culture, of politics, and of modernization as a driver to human flourishing. So Michael Rutland, who wrote in 1991, was former tutor to the fourth king and described Bhutan prior to its modernization as a virtually unknown kingdom. No roads, no telephones, no mail service, no airports, and virtually no shops. The economy was almost entirely based on barter. Healthcare was primitive or non-existent, and schooling was confined to the monasteries. And those who currently study Bhutan maintain that despite a degree of modernization, much of its way of life has remained largely unchanged. Even with significant levels of improvement to its physical infrastructure, it now has highways between Thimphu and Hara and so on. And so it's still described as a culturally secluded country. For some, the pace of change has not been rapid enough, courting the suggestion that Bhutan shuns foreign influence to its detriment, while for others it's precisely because of its geography and its expressed isolationist policies that its rich traditional culture has developed relatively undisturbed by external influence. So that is the core tension. At the heart of the debate is education in its form, its purpose, its functions. More precisely, what role does education play in the political, social, and economic life of the country? On the one hand, there's a strongly held view that national development and economic progress depends largely on a modern and globally aligned educational system, one that is responsive to a rapidly changing world economy and accommodative of the proliferation of new media, new technologies. On the other hand, is an equally strong belief that a modernized educational system that mirrors those of more industrialized societies threatens distinctly social and cultural ways of learning and patterns by which deeply held values and beliefs are communicated from one generation to another. One might say then that as the education system in Bhutan shapes and reshapes itself, there's a continuing tension between conservationism or conservation and extension. The enduring question is whether Bhutan can find a way to preserve the modes and traditions through which knowledge is made, while at the same time embrace new forms of thinking and new ways of learning. And of course, as it ascribes to the global education for all drive, the global equality for all drive, expand the share of its population participating in education? Or will culture and tradition be eschewed completely as Bhutan adopts what seems to be an irreversible pathway to a modern, and some might suggest, Western system of education? This is a dilemma that sits at the heart of Bhutan's struggle to afford its youth the opportunities associated with modernization and global connectedness, while at the same time preserving its rich cultural and social patterns of meaning making. How then is Bhutan navigating this pathway? Recognizing that educational change over time is anything but linear, this paper employs a set of metaphors such as advent and consolidation, attraction and adoption, adaptation and indigenization, extension and transformation, and differentiation and concordance to tease out some of the main dilemmas of Bhutan's modernization project and the key elements of educational thinking and actions throughout different periods, some of which persist from one period to another. So this is interesting. Whether I get through all of these periodizations is well, we'll see. but we'll try our best to get to this. Very interesting. I mean, I've written in this way before about other countries, this notion, French notion of longue durée, a sense that we take a long, hard look at the duration of ideas and the persistence of ideas. And it's particularly interesting to do so in Bhutan, where one sees a contradiction between ideas I've already pointed out in the introduction to this paper, this very strong tension between modernization and conservation of working this way. So, you know, why is this an interesting case study, particularly not just from the point of view of educational development, because although the paper talks a lot about the education system, I think my sense is really, and one hopes that we can achieve this in the papers that follow, is you know, to look nationally at a country, to look at a country context, and to look at, you know, its politics and its history, and that determines in every case, I would imagine, the shape that the educational system takes and the tensions therein. So I think, you know, in this third year for this project, we're kind of beyond the point of asking what I think was a very naive question to ask when we started out, which was, you know, is human flourishing an outcome of education? That all one needs to do to ensure and gender human flourishing at the end is to have a pretty good educational system, or at least including the informal, an educative way of ensuring that people, you know, attain, whether this is personal attainment or attain in a more formal sense, the kind of qualifications that enable them to secure good jobs and therefore good incomes and so on and so forth. But I think it is, you know, it was a pretty naive question, really, and many commentators in our series, and I think our colleagues from Harvard and so on, were equally acknowledging that perhaps that relationship between, or, you know, that the thinking that there was a strong positive correlation between a solid educational foundation and human flourishing at the end is simply an inadequate way of explaining how human beings, whether individually or in groups or in national states, achieve differential goals. And so the idea then of the paper is to look, and of the series, I hope, to look at national contexts, and in this way, through that lens, examine what the national project means for the direction and purpose of its educational system, and whether as a result, people, you know, education is very important, of course, in the lives of all of us. What implications does a national political ideological project have for you know, the values then enshrined in educational systems, its teaching, its curriculum? So there'll be interesting papers in this series. Natasha Robinson will talk on South Africa and look at history as a school subject. How does a country that has gone through painful years in racial segregation overcome that, and whether, you know, education or the teaching of history allows that to be easy. And you know, we've spoken about countries which, like Rwanda, which was genocide, and so on, and the important role of education in this. Anyway, I don't want to get ahead of myself, so how are we doing for time, Fiona? And I'll sort of
it's half past.
What's meaning?
We've got another half hour.
Not another half an hour. Okay, so I'm going to have to skip through a variety of things, but let's look at the earliest forms of education in Bhutan are thought to have been the religious teachings of a saint from the Swat Valley who visited Bhutan in 746 AD, but the development of a more formal monastic system of education is attributed to Zabdrung Namgyal in the 1594 to 1651, the Tibetan abbot, and under his rule a central monk body was established for the purposes of providing formal education in Buddhist philosophy, liturgical chanting, dialectics and linguistics. The monastic education offered its students lessons in philosophy, in ritual, in meditation techniques, and so on. And students attained literacy in Shokhe, script used mainly for memorizing religious texts. And skipping through a few bits, but monastic education was restricted both in terms of what it offered and to whom. So one of my former doctoral students, Chelsea Rubles, writes in her dissertation that a single purpose of monastic curriculum was to prepare a small number of students to become monks. Admission into monastic institutions was not widely available and undertaken mainly by boys from privileged families. So monastic education was restricted not only to wealthier families, but also largely to males. Women were excluded with the exception of a few nuns, and several scholars on Bhutan argue that religious training provided to nuns were of lower quality than that provided to monks. So monastic education in Bhutan thus assumed a particular form and function and was largely restricted. But this in theocracy did not pose any particular social or cultural problems. So moving on a few years and use the metaphor of attraction and adoption, political transition in Bhutan from a traditional theocracy to a monarchy in 1907 marked a change in the functions of the government away from maintaining the institution of religion to guiding the nation towards development and shifting away from decades of self-imposed isolation from the outside world. Although the Buddhist ideology of the country remained intact, the primary function of the state was no longer solely religious. But having embarked on the road to national development, Bhutan required an educational system that would support this project, and it looked with interest at the British education model. Modern education started during the era of the first king, Ugyen Wangchuck, in 1907 to 1926. And he was keen to develop modern education for selected boys. In 1914, a school started, and in 1915, another school was founded at the King's Palace in Bhutan, especially for his heir and a few other boys. Also in 1914, 46 boys were sent to a Scottish missionary school in India. As Chelsea, my student working on this, suggested, that the decision to look outside of the country for an education system suited to national development goals was steered by His Majesty Dorje Wangchuck, who may have been influenced by his own educational experience as a student in Kalimpong, where he was educated in a British manner. His Majesty drew influence from his visits to Scotland and Switzerland and chose elements that were suitable to Bhutan. It seems then that Bhutan's attraction towards the Western model was sparked by the third king's own experiences and perceptions of education in the West being a pillar of modernization. So the first modern schools were established then in the 1950s and supported by Great Britain. Indeed, they were modeled in the fashion of British independent schools, their form and content, to all intents and purposes, British. Interestingly, while the model of British schooling was the attraction, it was the fact that they had taken root in India that provided the impetus to their replication in Bhutan. Indeed, not only were these English medium schools imported from India, so too were the textbooks and the teachers. By the 1960s, there were several such British independent schools in Bhutan, but they were not unified by a common curriculum. Father Mackay, a Canadian Jesuit priest who taught the children of the king, claims he had a significant influence on the development of modern education in Bhutan. He drafted the first education policy documents in 1963 and fashioned the content of the curriculum and the medium through which it was taught. He faced two major difficulties. First, that the selection of a language of instruction of over 17 dialects spoken in the country. Shoke was the only form of language that was written and well spoken. However, Shoke was reserved solely for religious purposes and was thus determined to be inappropriate as a medium for instruction in a secular system of education. Dzongkha, the national language, is also the dominant language used in the western region of Bhutan. However, if it was employed as a medium of instruction, Bhutanese students would find it difficult to pursue further educational studies outside of Bhutan. English was eventually chosen as a medium of instruction in the secular school system, the perceived benefits outweighing the disadvantages. It was seen to be an international language used widely in the neighboring India. Pointed out there were no secondary schools in Bhutan prior to 1960, and selected groups of Bhutanese students attended secondary school in India. So this language question, very interesting, sort of persists also across Africa. This debate about whether English or French or should be used as national languages. An ongoing debate in Rwanda, who despise the French for their perceived role in the Interahamwe, so they chuck out French textbooks, they kick out the French, they are unfriendly, and so on. But looking at other languages that might offer common access across in that part of Africa, the East Africa community for attendance of universities or secondary schools or jobs, and to make those pathways a little bit like the idea we had with the European Union and so on. So it's a question that doesn't go away somehow. There was another problem, basically. There were no qualified Bhutanese teachers to teach the curriculum or school administrators to run schools. So Father Mackay filled these positions with staff from India, and thus introducing Bhutan to a wholly foreign model. This was met with some resistance. One of the biggest problems for Bhutan in this period was that many Bhutanese considered the modern system of education alien and were skeptical of its social utility. It's interesting, therefore, that the first students were conscripted into schooling, and despite efforts to indigenize the curriculum, many referred to the system as a colonial relic. It's clear then that the introduction of modern education had far-reaching consequences, and there's an argument that the shift from traditional, mainly monastic, and modern education led many people to believe that monastic communities were non-productive and social parasites in economic terms, and that the traditional system was a resilient leftover from the past. So it's very interesting, the sort of sense that Bhutan needed to modernize, and therefore its schooling system needed to modernize, but the practicalities of that being not so easily overcome. So Bhutan looked to India, who supplied the curriculum and the textbooks and the teachers, and of course the question of language was imported. But the overriding value, it seemed, for the selected few attending these new public schools under a new system was also the persuasion that actually, they were the face of the modern Bhutan, and that anything else was sort of relics of the past and shouldn't exist. And really, one began to see then the makings of really quite a serious internal tension. What does that mean for flourishing? Well, this is perhaps an interesting question we come back to in conclusion. And when we think of flourishing as a national project and not as an individual state of mind or a set of collective endeavours that have, that ultimately reach a conclusion when, as I said, slums are improved and so on. And of course, there are other projects that people do, and one can associate that with flourishing. But a national project, one that seeks to modernize, take people out of poverty, take people out of subjugation in the sense of resistance to colonialism, as I suspect one or two papers might do. These are national projects guided by national frameworks. They're guided by a sense of national politics, influenced by international politics in one way or the other. Much of this history is a history of a time of a Cold War, where ideologically, we had the Soviet bloc, with certainly many countries in Latin America, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Fidel, and so on, subscribing very much to that way of looking at the world, a socialist, a Marxist way. Many countries in Africa, like Tanzania, and of course, their educational systems were governed by that block of ideological thinking, as opposed to a bloc led by the United States and Britain and elsewhere, which is strongly capitalist in its views and orientations, and countries that subscribe to that. Germany was split into two, East Germany and West Germany, one half of the country subscribing to a national project with an ideology driven by the Soviet Union. So that period, it's not just about national politics, it's about how national politics ascribe, in a sense, to a world view, a global world view, and what those tensions mean for, people have spoken of equal development or not. What does this mean in a country torn in half by ideological splits, or in this case, the case of Bhutan, splits in thinking about conservation or modernization. So the paradox of modernization and preservation presented itself more sharply in this period. The challenge, it seems, was to adapt the form and content of schooling to suit the national character of Bhutan, while recognizing that the country's broader goals had changed. National development was the watchword, and educated and trained manpower, in inverted commas, the ultimate goal. But not, it seems, at the cost of losing its spiritual and cultural heritage. There was an additional persistent challenge: how to adapt the model of schooling imported from Britain via India, teachers and all. By the start of the sixth 50-year plan in 1987 to 1992, several successive educational reforms had been sought to both contextualize the curriculum and to orient schooling towards national development goals. Having been structured on the Indian system, the education system in Bhutan needed to be reformed to relate to the values, environment, and the history of Bhutanese people. There's a quote from the Planning Commission of 1987. The educational challenge for Bhutan in this period was to both point the system in the direction of national development and reform it so that it was more Bhutanese in character and outlook. By the fifth and sixth 5-year plans emphasize the conservation of traditional Bhutanese heritage and the reorientation of the curriculum to make the content relevant to Bhutanese people. And the next metaphor describing a particular period is extension and transformation. Since its first 5-year plan, the royal government of Bhutan had made significant investments to expand modern education alongside monastic education. Between 1997 and 2007, Bhutan adopted its 8th, 9th, and 10th 5-year plans. This was the decade that saw rapid social transformation in Bhutan, increased international engagement, and an educational system striving to keep up. The formal introduction of television and the internet in 2001, and the shift in state leadership from monarchy to democratic monarchy in 2008 created massive anxiety about cultural change and loss. World Bank data showed that internet users rose from 1% of the population in 2001 to 25% in 2012. But it's also a period of net growth in school enrollments from 34% in 2005 to 56% in 2012. And unemployment dropped from 3.8% of the total labor force to 2.1%. The rapid growth of work opportunities and growth of international communications brought Bhutan in much closer contact with the international community than it had ever been before. Participation in education had risen exponentially, as had literacy rates. According to the Bhutan Living Standard Survey in 2003, the literacy rate in the age group of 10 to 14 years old was 75.3%. Unsurprisingly, the prominence and prestige of English grew, as did perceptibly so the social preference for Western culture and values. I always, when people say, well, what happened to the socialist bloc? What happened when the wall came down in East Germany? What drove it? And my rather sort of fanciful remark was that it was bubblegum and blue jeans. As soon as the East Germans saw Levi's, that was it. So this kind of preference for Western culture and values, but it's seen in what youngsters watch and on television and so on and so forth. Understandably, the prolific rise in the use of English and its accessibility through both electronic and print media presented a concern to the cultural conservationists. It was seen to threaten the use of Zonka and other local languages. But there was also a wider concern that the rise of English distorted perceptions of what it meant to be a person capable of making a contribution to society, economically, socially, and politically. And this is where, just as an aside, I actually think that, in many ways, China and its protection of Confucianism has protected an old system through which it draws for its young people very, very interesting and traditional and old social values about morality and so on. So, this is not a paper on China, but it's very interesting to see some of these similarities that, of course, as China modernizes and thinks about its own system and tries to assert itself on the world stage, there are, and grafts very cleverly. China are marvelous educational surgeons, able to graft the best of different societies into their own system. It now outperforms any country in the world on the PISA tests for 15-year-olds in scientific literacy and mathematical literacy and so on. Even though there are only 4 localities that participate, Shanghai and Beijing and so on. So, it outperforms Britain and Finland, who did hold that position on all of these, but remarkably, it also preserves fundamentally very important traditional ways of looking at values that make the person. And for China, as it is in this argument for Bhutan, that doesn't rest necessarily with the framework of education in our world as we see it. So our world is made up out of lots of projects, aren't they? Projects that seem to want to drive the idea of character, the idea of shaping our personalities and our dispositions in one way or the other. And some of these societies really have historical, traditional, well-rooted traditions and frameworks where it happens naturally as a matter of growing up in the system. Punso, for example, argues that in modern Bhutan, being literate means having fluency in English, and as Dorje 2006 study revealed, for most Bhutanese, English is regarded as a language of education, social status, social position, and prestige, while local languages are seen by some to represent traditional pre-modern Bhutan and as such have very little value in modern life. And economically, Rodder suggests that fluency in English is now a requirement for entry into positions in the civil service. And that, of course, is very, very new. So, okay, how am I doing on time? It's just about to wind up or down a little bit. I did a study with some colleagues here in Oxford. I was invited. My first exposure to Bhutan was an invitation from UNESCO, who said, well, "Can you come and study the science education?" I said, "Well, I'm not a scientist in that sense of the word, and I have no idea how one studies a science curriculum. But I know some colleagues who do, and so on. But they insisted that I lead then a small team, which we did, and had fantastic time, going into classrooms at the cusp of a reform of science education in Bhutan. And I might just put down my notes for 1 minute and perhaps just explain, how we saw the tensions that in these classrooms, teachers teaching science, and just the skill that was needed to navigate and mediate, if you like, traditional conceptions of, say, what is it that explains an earthquake? What explains lightning? And there are, of course, clear and long-standing traditional explanations for phenomena such as, geological changes in the weather, etc., all sorts of scientific things. And of course, there are the modern explanations and modern textbooks. Not that one thing is more right than another. Question for us was, how does one mediate a knowledge system with which young people have grown up, which is a traditional knowledge system that is built from having, daily meals with one's family and growing up in a household or communities where informal discussions about the world and its phenomena, what happens, and so on. These explanations are, form part of a knowledge system, a framework. Then one confronts a rather alien system, dating back only to the sort of 1960s, with modern, and one doesn't say they're wrong, absolutely right, scientific explanations of these phenomena. How does one mediate those a kind of knowledge? And it's clearly clearly wrong to put down one explanation and favour another. I think that would be, you know, and you know, this is what educationalists and policymakers are kind of struggling with. How do we preserve some semblance of a traditional knowledge system? And we're seeing this problem in other parts of the world in health. You know, the roles that midwives play or nurses. I mean, most currently during the COVID crisis in South Asia, in Africa, in many other parts of the world, finding explanations that are modern and scientific and completely right in their analysis of what the problem is, and mediating that with historical explanations, some of that which are also historically influenced. In Africa, been through a whole, in the 1950s and 60s, you know, one of the big world projects was to try and trim population growth. That led, of course, to many interventions, including, you know, some not so kind methods of birth control, and people don't forget that. You know, say, oh, this was a devilish project by the West to kill us, and so on and so forth. You know, so turning up with the kind of COVID injection, you know, aligned with historical explanations of international relations and what we saw as outside attempts to curb growth. Yeah, on the news today that China's population is now officially seen as diminishing, and they're worried about that. But anyway, it's not a paper on China or Africa, it's a paper on Bhutan. But anyway, look, shall I? You think I've said enough? I don't need to sort of go all the way to the end of this paper, do I, or what? Shall I? Well, we've got 5 minutes, or what?
I'm very happy to open the floor to questions and, you know, and then I think that will prompt a further discussion.
Yeah.
Because it's certainly for me, I find it's been a fascinating paper and insight into the kind of evolution of a system and how it still makes English its primary language of education, despite drawing on kind of their very, you know, their own history of and culture.
Yeah, maybe I'll just end with a few words. So culturally and socially, the rapid pace of change in Bhutan seems to have driven a wedge between the old world and the new world, the old and new worlds, and created a demand for people to make sense of their daily lives with reference to both worlds. And the various writers like Engelhardt and Wells will offer examples of parents engaged in agricultural livelihood, relying on traditional rationales to explain the unpredictable forces of nature, while their son or daughter attends a secondary school in an urban area, studying science and technology as sources of authority on matters of daily life. Living in different worlds can, for instance, be seen in this quotation from Whitecross. From them, I began to learn about and refine my understanding of Bhutanese life and culture and concerns. The youngest nephew was a traditionally trained Amchi, a doctor who completed his studies not in Bhutan, but at the Chakpori Institute of Tibetan Medicine in Darjeeling. Initially educated in a small primary school in Denchen Schooling, a few miles north of the capital, Thimphu. He later attended school in Thimphu before studying at Chakpori. His older brother, after briefly attending primary school, entered a monastery at a young age in Bhutan before being placed in a new monastery near Kathmandu. By his late 20s, he completed a formal education at a Tibetan monastery in southern India and being appointed as a teacher in the monastery and so on. Unlike the brother, their mother lacked formal education, as did her sister. However, the mother recited prayers memorized from being taught orally to her as a child and later by her husband. Their uncle, a former monk, was educated in the monastery and he was able to read and write in classical Tibetan. And what was the point of the quote? I suppose just really that with all these different exposures to education and commentary on what daily life was, and so at this kind of confluence of the old and the new, really trying as a household to come to terms with needs and desires and aspirations, much of them in the sense of how do we progress, how do we flourish, how do we grow, very constrained by the kind of meeting of the old and the new worlds. And I think I'll end there.
Bravo, thank you very much. Before I open the floor to everybody, online and in person, Jonathan, I was going to ask you to have a few words in response to David's paper.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, David, for an extremely interesting talk, drawing on personal experience, and even extensive research in Bhutan. You and I talked about that briefly before, but I've never heard you talk in such depth about it. It's so interesting to hear about your work there and your experiences there and where you're going with this now and your reflections on that. There's a load of things I'd like to ask you. First of all, I guess something that's kind of a couple of questions of clarification to really get to the heart of the tension you've identified between what you described as conservation versus expansion, or conservation versus extension, sorry. And you kind of used the word modernization to refer to extension. Am I right in understanding that as a kind of a tension between preserving traditional values in Bhutan as contrasted with what we might call progressivism, for example, in education, for example, a move towards secularism or embracing other cultural ideas more within Bhutanese culture? Is that the tension you see?
Yeah.
And so why is Bhutan particularly unique or particularly distinctive then in this? Because it seems that we get a similar kind of tension in various other cultures. For example, various Eastern cultures or in the global South wanting to embrace, say, certain Western values more, or at least there being a movement among some to embrace more Western values, particularly within education, or a dominance of English within education, for example, in Uganda, and having problems associated with colonialism. What is it about Bhutan, do you think, that's, if not unique, makes it a particularly interesting case study? You mentioned, for example, the distinction between the old and the new ways of living, if you like, or new cultures. There's, of course, the the gross happiness index, and there may be other factors too. What is it, do you think, that makes it particularly interesting?
Yeah, I mean, look, I suppose with Bhutan, unlike a lot of societies in Africa, for example, the colonial project, so intervention in Africa came quite early on, and so traditional ways of thinking or meaning making or doing, was, some might argue, to a large degree sort of obliterated, and the most people actually saw that gaining an education in the way that Britain or France or etc. brought it to these countries was actually a positive move, and they understood industrialization and development and essentially human growth and flourishing as being an outcome of those systems. But what makes Bhutan different is, of course, that they've been a secluded society. They protected themselves, in a sense, from that kind of foreign influence, and we've been gently persuaded, in small steps to go in that direction. Hence, this history of how educational development and indeed national development took root. But I suppose also recognizing that many societies in other parts of the world had actually lost their sense of, what it means to conserve knowledge systems and so on, and had in time sort of lost that, and Bhutan didn't really want to, at least as a strong section of people who don't want to lose, they don't want to kind of chuck out the baby with the bathwater, and see value in these traditional systems, and have also seen the possibility of being able to protect that, and somehow their search has been to bring to knowledge systems, to ways of making meaning, not that they necessarily vastly contradictory, but to try and broker an understanding between these cultural ways of thinking and being, and so on. And underneath all of that, of course, are therefore, cultural and important traditional perspectives on what it means to flourish without that meaning, become wealthier or become healthier, as many of our papers in the last 2 years were sort of beginning to suggest that it's through wealth creation and access to health and so on that flourishing, is an outcome. For the Bhutanese, they often talk about where they live in relation to, the track that leads to the top of the mountain or the bottom. It's kind of this kind of idea of gross national happiness is a deep sort of meaning. It says how do we flourish traditionally, even being perhaps not as wealthy or relatively undeveloped and so on. And I think that is the difference. It's just looking at that tension within Bhutan, really the fight to conserve and the fight to preserve against the fight to modernize at all costs.
Great, thank you.
Well, hands are going up online.
Oh,
so Berry, I'd like to call on you to unmute and ask your question, please.
Hi, first of all, I just loved that. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to, I found a little quote that I'm just going to read you from Crocodile Dundee, because I really enjoyed how you were talking, because I'm in science education, and not only was the whole thing wonderful, but even particularly wonderful where you were talking about that juggling between the new world and the old. So when I teach the students, I use this quote from Crocodile Dundee, and after I've read it to you, I'm going to ask you whether you've got a better real life one. Okay, so you talked about the difficulty for people managing those two worlds, and I'm going to ask you whether you've got a version that you discovered worked. Was there a version of lightning, for example, that worked? But just to give you a moment to think. I'm not going to do the Australian accent. I did have a stage of being able to do Australian accents, but I can't now. So this is actually a character in the movie called Neville. And it was when I first kind of even woke up to this idea of two worlds. And Crocodile Dundee says of Neville, you see, Nev's a real city boy. Oh, we are doing a bit Australian, I hear. Okay, you see, Nev's a real city boy, but his dad's a tribal elder. And, well, you see, Aborigines don't own the land. They belong to it. It's like their mother. See those rocks? Been standing there for 600 million years. Still be there when you and I are gone. So arguing over who owns them is a bit like two fleas arguing over who owns the dog they live on. So I've used that quote to talk about people sort of managing these two worlds. And I don't know if you remember the movie, but he literally arrives in his city clothes and then kind of gets changed into his sort of tribal elder's sun robes. But as I say, I just wondered if you met any examples of people making it work.
That's a wonderful quote, and I'm going to steal that and remember it. I hope and write it down and stick with it, because it's despite the movie it comes from, I think it's a really fantastic way, of talking about heritage and culture, and that all the debates around, as you say, who owns the mountains or who owns the land and so on, a bit trite in respect of First Peoples and so on, a very sort of different relationship to it. But other people who make it work. I mean, the teachers we saw, these science teachers, just remarkable in trying to mediate these two worlds. And, you know, I mean, they had to dig deep to draw on their own cultural and historical understandings of things, and find a language and find a way that didn't make them one or the other. You know, I think of African nurses, you know, in the context of Ebola or AIDS, etc. You know, how do they remain part of? Yeah, people know them. This is my sister, my cousin, my neighbor, who is a nurse. You know, has she become a sort of somebody from a different world who are trying to encourage us to use an injection or this medication, etc., contrary to our teachings from traditional healers and so on. So these professionals in the front line, the teachers, the nurses, and so on, all over the place. I mean, they just dig deep and have to find a way somehow to mediate these different understandings of these different worlds in a way that doesn't preference one above the other. So it's pretty hard, and I think they do a remarkable job. You know how, you know, who knows how they do. We've seen lessons in science that are absolutely fantastic in this. But I think there's another paper. I'd probably give some. So if you just to drop me an email, I might send you the paper where perhaps a few more examples are more evident. But thanks for that. It's correct.
I'd now like to call on Eric Marshall, who recently joined Templeton World Charity Foundation as Director of Discovery. Eric, over to you.
Oh, thanks so much, and very truly enjoyed your presentation. I have a question. It was very interesting, the term you used in terms of tension between traditional culture and modernity. And I had an experience with Bhutan the last time I was there. I think it was 2015, visited with the Curriculum Development Center working on the national frameworks, particularly in science education. And I was very interested in this question of how do they make their curriculum relevant? How do they tie it to their cultural and traditional values, being a Buddhist country, and having G&H as their driver. And what I remember learning there was that previously they had imported wholesale curriculum from outside Bhutan, and that was not working. So then they, and you may have been involved in advising this, you know, they then created new curriculum that was regionalized. But I was looking more recently at the 2022 Science Curriculum Framework, and it looks like their assessment of that was that it was perhaps not rigorous enough and perhaps not connected enough to the modernity. So there seems, this tension seems to create a struggle where they go between the two extremes. And I'd be interested if you have any insights into how they navigate to find that balance between, you know, the traditional cultural values that they speak about, but it's not sure how integrated they are. Like now they refer to it as the complementarity between spirituality and science, as opposed to perhaps integrated, and also making it relevant to, you know, traditional culture, and so that the students can see themselves in it. So wondering if you could say anything about the process that a nation goes through and what you've seen in navigating how to find that balance between tradition and modernity.
That's a really good question, and you know, to be honest, I don't really know where I stand. One part of me, I mean, I taught a little bit as for a little while in the 1980s as a school teacher in Zimbabwe, a fascinating country. Had just sort of won its independence, and the new government came into fascinating people. Fei Chung, a sort of Chinese woman who fought with the guerrillas in the bush became the first minister, emerging with a sort of AK-47s, putting that down and framing the curriculum with a chap who's still currently at the World Bank, Zingai and Butambuka and so on. Of course, they felt that the eyes of the world were upon them, but not only, so the eyes of the outside world were upon them. Where do they go in an educational system? Looking at the more recent history in Africa at the time, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania just completely chucked out English as a medium of instruction, went for Swahili, chucked out the curriculum framework in all its form, and went with Mao in China and said, this is education with production. We're a kind of African socialism in education, and it's a very different, so it was a very radical departure. So Zimbabwe, in the 1980s, the eyes of the world is looking at, what would happen to the curriculum. But I felt there was a more important set of eyes on the Zimbabwean officials, and that, like in Bhutan, I think, although I'm not sure I have the evidence, but I feel it in my bones, as my grandmother used to say, that it is also the eyes of the parents, as it was in Zimbabwe, that is on the education officials. And the one thing that Zimbabwe, I think they must have had a sort of parental consultation, and they must have been warned by parents saying, we will lose trust in you if you, for example, abolish the Cambridge assessment framework. And so much that it was a radical new government that tried to introduce into the curriculum, political economy and so on and so forth. And you now have, of course, this big drive to decolonizing the curriculum and so on. And many governments struggle with this. What does relevance mean? How do you create those alignments? And actually, I think the Zimbabwean model in the 1980s almost, in an unintended way, was probably, as I said, I don't know if I'd sacrifice my life for the answer, but actually to say, perhaps rather than search for a solution that is a kind of fusion or a truly complementary, is to live with the contradiction that if our people, if nationally we want to maintain trust in government, etc., it is not to destroy the Cambridge examination certificate, whatever that looks like in perception and in historical term, but keeping it provides a way for our students to go to medical schools in the UK and so on and so forth. And so that recognition of what is important to set out in terms of the national project, the political project, the desire for conservation in Bhutan, the sense of cultural heritage and how we protect that, shouldn't, in a sense, stand in conflict with, some modern features, if that if that allows a proper, entry point and connection point to world economic systems or world educational systems and so on. So it's a big question, but how do you convince sometimes politicians who are, who have different motives in these things? A very hard question, but a very interesting one. I don't know the answer really, but
Thanks.
So Katie Amis, welcome back to our series.
Hello. Nice to see you, Fiona, and nice to see you all. Thank you so much for this presentation. I found this so interesting, the discussion in Bhutan on really this tension between traditional culture, traditional worldviews, and the sort of institutional maintenance of those worldviews, and then the tension from outside. I've recently been involved with something in Bhutan related to parenting, and this evolution from highly authoritarian parenting structures toward introduction of greater parent-child communication and responsive caregiving. And you see this this tension between between traditional cultures, the taking of the good, but modernizing of things like physical punishment and other forms that might not be healthy. And it's very interesting what you were sharing about Bhutan. I wanted to share another case in terms of Brazil. There's a person named Maria Barcelos who lives and works with the Surui Indian tribe and sort of had first contact with them with sort of any Western civilization about 50 or 60 years ago. And one of the interesting efforts that they're doing as that tribe has sort of evolved and gotten like a registered status and things like that is to educate youth who are maybe the tribal elders but are very young and getting modernized, but yet they're in charge of making decisions about when mining companies come or resource extraction companies come, and educating sort of traditional and tribal youth on understanding science and technology and cosmology, so that they can like live in both worlds, go and wear jeans in the city, and also like function in a more indigenous sort of cultural context. And I see that it's just very interesting that we see where there are cultures or niches of cultures where spirituality is integrated, or where it's the main worldview of seeing the world. We see massive pressure on globalization and on youth. And we see that sort of worldview slipping. And so I think I really appreciate you bringing up the case of Bhutan, and there are other sort of niches and corners in the world that are going through similar sort of challenges in terms of this sort of influence of the North and the West on a decrease in the value and interest placed on the role of spirituality and religion in daily life and in the worldview. So I appreciate your bringing it up, and I feel like it warrants even more discussion. So thanks for that.
Thank you, and thanks for drawing our attention to the example of Brazil. Very, very fitting. Thank you.
Go on then.
No.
No. It's okay.
Well, I agree with that. I was one thing that occurs to me is the relationship between the child and the parent is an important part of flourishing. And what you described might lead to all sorts of conflicts. That on the one hand, maybe some parents want to maintain their social status in society, and they're very happy for the child to learn English and move forward through that. But they would maybe not be so happy to find the child not valuing the traditional wisdom of the generation. Did you find out much about generational conflict?
Yeah, I suppose the that sort of last quote I was hoping would lead there, and somehow the paper seemed to not follow the quote, but it was precisely that. As interesting, from both sides. So there's from the parental point of view, strong, interest in ensuring that cultural values handed down one generation to the other isn't lost through, in Bhutan, a sort of creeping modernization. But it's also interesting to look at societies, that move out of their context and set up home elsewhere. So, let's say Chinese families in the United States, and the expectation on eating together at home and doing things in a way that is appropriate. But these young people grow up meeting, as they should and would, American friends, and the culture might be a little bit, well, let's grab a burger or let's grab a milkshake. And it's interesting how, and to bring it back to Bhutan, that young people in Bhutan too have to find a way of navigating these expectations from a growing sense of popular youth culture, the watching of television, the change of wearing in clothing and so on. And so, it's really interesting the way it presents itself. I was on a flight to Islamabad years ago, and it was sort of an hour before the aircraft was beginning to descend. There was a long queue in the toilet. And interesting how young women emerged who were, sort of wearing jeans and t-shirts, came out of the toilet and were dressed in the shalwar kameez because they were being met at the airport. And that, that interplay between what is expected and culturally and traditionally, and what it means to grow up in a modern society. So these things are creeping in. And,
Thank you.
Well, my question is quite macro, and probably it's good that it comes at the end because it might bring up more questions than answers. But I think that there's something really important to be said about the shifts, as you're saying, between conservation and modernization, but at this point in time having to do with moving away, not from traditional values, but from the previously held concept of modernization, or like this ideal of development that we've been following for so long. And I'm just going to read what I wrote as you were speaking, because I think otherwise I'll get off track. But with the growing realization of the massive impact of environmental upheaval on human life and societies, I think the framework of conservation and modernization in terms of flourishing is shifting. We can no longer expect growth as such in the linear form that former development. And in fact, the impact of climate disasters is causing a greater challenge. Recently, looking more at the droughts in Somalia, northern Kenya, and southeastern Ethiopia, and those are causing conflicts over resources, internally displaced peoples, children dropping out of schools, or having no prospects when they graduate. So these events are justifying global calls for new ideas of green growth and even degrowth for long-term flourishing, which in turn introduce new objectives for education to contend with. But the education systems in many of these countries, as your paper suggests in the context of Bhutan, are afloat between equally swinging political aims. You can just look at Brazil, the shift between Bolsonaro's objectives and Lula's objectives in terms of environmental conservation. So I guess my question is, how do we create responsive but resilient education systems that can cope with these kinds of swings in governance or shifts in national projects, as you put it?
Yeah, brilliantly framed question as ever. I suppose what I should, just perhaps re-emphasize is, also not to create the idea that, the traditional is free of contradiction. And I think, I think Barry's earlier intervention and so on, quite on point. There are things in more traditional societies that are constraining of human development. Not that it's their fault, but the world's kind of moved on, and modernization, whether you embrace it or not, there are aspirations that has come with that, and there are clearly benefits to allowing girls to go to school and all the rest of it. So there are contradictions on both in both the kind of conservation ideals, because conservation shouldn't be retrogressive, shouldn't be sort of Taliban style. Girls are, because traditionally societies saw themselves in that way, a kind of remaking of traditional values in a way that is anti-progressive, and there's a danger there, and and so by comparison to them, that modernization has its ills, but it also has progressive sort of elements to it. So what is the kind of new way? And this perhaps, rather than answer the question directly introduces a new set of problems for us. So it's only maybe 4 or 5 years ago that I think it was either Kenya or Zambia's very, very eloquent Minister of Tourism, I think it was Kenya, joined in the debate on conservation debate on ivory and elephant tusks and the terrible inhumane slaughter of these elements by trophy. But as the Indian position is, and as the African position, Southern African position, where there are large herds of these things, the new variant to that debate was, new forms of development, and this is what I think constrains talks on targets and so on and so on. That many countries and BRICS countries in particular are arguing industrially on emissions, but on the conservation side, India or Kenya would say, we have large herds of elephants. They need to be sensitively culled, and we need to be able to get, we can't burn ivory. We can't burn these tusks. There were demonstrations of burning tusks, but we have to cull elephant because the extent to which they come into, they live cheek by jowl with rural populations, and India makes this argument very strongly. It points to the statistics of people killed by large animals, or kind of encroaching. So there's this debate, and I think this new way of understanding modernization or conservation or development also brings about tensions between what looks like a sort of strong, modern, progressive view on how one conserves elephant population or tigers or whatever it is, or targets on emission, and a very strong, sometimes, response by countries who feel that that might actually constrain their own visions for national development, and what does one do with potentially sources of, if you like, natural wealth. So it's an uncomfortable debate, and again, it's not that one takes one side or the other in relation to that debate. It's just pointing out that the contradictions inherent in the old come new conservation debate, the old come new modernization debate, and the kind of third way debate all come with enormous new questions, and it's not so easy to find an accommodation.
Thank you. One final question.
Barry, I think, wanted to
Yes,
come back.
that's right.
Yeah, yes.
Barry.
I'd like a question.
Yes, of course. And then so we'll just make you the last question after Barry.
It sort of follows on. I was going to say, first of all, I think now is such an important time to be asking the questions that you're asking, because we're all about to, even in those countries that are only getting there now, we're all about to be on our mobile phones. I have to say, not personally, you understand, but the sort of the drive for youth is towards being on mobiles. And it's interesting that most web browsers will now give you the content that they give you in whatever language it is they assume you want to speak. So they don't ask you. You can deliberately change the language of your web browser, but your web browser otherwise will assume what language you want, and it will then translate the pages for you. But of course, that's only surface deep. If actually all it's doing is translating those traditional curriculum documents, because those are the only ones it can find, that underneath what appears to be the veneer of your own language is really just the good old, traditional Western structures. So it's such an important time to be kind of confronting these questions. And I have a passion for a project that will create a search engine so that we can offer schools ways of genuinely searching into the content that will appeal and suit those cultures, so that we are confronting those questions, because otherwise, as I say, I think the question just disappears because the technology wipes it out. It doesn't give you sight of it. It just takes you straight to, as I say, what is already so present on the internet, which are the existing Western traditional science kind of structures. So I wondered if you saw technology creeping in, because you hinted at it at one point, and then you sort of went off and started to talk about something else. So I was just going to kind of bring you back to it and say, were you already starting to see, or is the drift towards technology, is that something that you could already see signs of?
Massive. As I think I used that World Bank statistic just to show the growth in internet users having risen exponentially, and the paper's a little bit dated, so it had gone from like 3% to 25%, but much higher now, and much as I'm sure Eric will have recognized in his travels there, there'd be, as part of these curriculum modernizations and so on and so forth, would be the idea of laptops and tablets and so on to complement the curriculum and to produce help gain access to content far away. But I was going to say about your search engine, go for it. And I've just finished writing a eulogy for a very dear friend and professor who passed away. I'll be speaking at his funeral in a week or so. And some of the words was really, if you're going to do the search engine, perhaps not just the words, not just the kind of grammatical surface, but really a search engine to explore and to probe what lies behind the many words that are written, because I think that is the essence of this debate. More content and more easy access to it, isn't really, but part of the debate is what is the essence behind, and can we find perhaps in Bhutan a different sense of essence, and to make that kind of spirit of meaning or spirit of understanding, or cultural notions of it, to make those ideas and so on, hopefully not necessarily aligned, but appreciated in equal measure and so on, and critically appraised in equal measure by young people. So go for the search engine. Sounds like a fantastic project.
And our final question from the floor.
It's a question and a comment. It's pretty clear that the government had, as a policy before the advent of television and the internet, a very deliberate policy to limit tourism, to stop people coming in, because it was seen that the advent of large numbers of strangers would corrupt culture, and that was part of the whole policy of gross national happiness. So when everything began to change at the millennium, or just after the millennium, has the government sought to control tourism in the same kind of way, or is it just completely open space? The physical isolation of Bhutan made limiting tourism easy. People couldn't just come in. But has that policy now changed? And do you feel that it adds to the whole conundrum of modernization and change and the loss of traditional culture?
I'm looking at Eric because I haven't been recently, but I suspect it's still quite limited. There was only one airline when I traveled, Druk Airlines. I don't know if they've expanded the number of airlines, and it's certainly very expensive to visit Bhutan as a tourist. So, you really have to be quite keen to do so. So I don't think there's wholesale expansion, and it is still very controlled and very protected in a way. And so, I think the pressure on external contact and the pressure of being able to look over the mountains at what is happening elsewhere comes from the youth who increasingly have, they do, there are televisions now in the cities, and they do see, large slices of life in the UK and the US and India and elsewhere, and in many ways they want a part of it.
Yeah.
And
Is there a university now, and are many people finishing secondary school going outside for university training?
Yeah, again, I mean, there's the Royal University. What do you think, Erica? A lot more expansion on some of the higher education facilities there, and certainly a growth in more modern secondary schooling. Eric, do you agree?
Oh, I would agree. And again, most of my research was done, 6-7 years ago, but I looked particularly at secondary and post-secondary education in science and technology, very applied, but they, in strategic areas, they were growing that. And, in terms of values, education and open-mindedness is key. And the frameworks, the curriculum frameworks for primary and secondary that's one of, I think there are 4 main objectives, is to create a thirst for knowledge, as well as building a workforce.
Super. Well, thank you for the great questions, everybody. David, thank you for a fabulous talk, and look forward to seeing you it's 5 o'clock this time next week. The visiting fellow, Dr. Gareen Kalusian from World Learning, will be speaking about Lebanon and the importance of social and emotional learning in conflict settings. So big round of applause.